Induction at Pittsburgh, 1889.
Although George Westinghouse had made his fortune with the invention of air brakes for trains, he was not just a railroad man. He was a descendant of the aristocratic Russian von Westinghausen family. His father was also an inventor, with 6 fundamental patents of farming machinery. With his brother Henry, who later became his partner, George early on was introduced to such devices as the battery and the sparking Leyden jar, a glass jar lined with foil and used for storing an electric charge.
Having been a cavalry boy, and later a Navy engineer during the Civil War, George Westinghouse had experience and vision. He knew that the future was in electricity.
In late July 1888, Tesla took a train to Pittsburgh to meet with George Westinghouse and finalize the sale of his patents. It may have been the middle of summer, but oddly, the inventor welcomed the intense heat.
He looked forward to the meeting.
Considerable in stature, with a walrus-sized moustache, Chester C. Arthur sideburns, and a remarkable wife of equal proportion who wore a bustle that jutted 3 feet to the rear, Westinghouse greeted the lanky inventor.
A garrulous man, George Westinghouse subsumed those around him with his geniality and unbounded confidence. He took Tesla to his home and then on a tour of the plant.
With nearly 400 employees, Westinghouse's electric company was mainly producing alternators, transformers and accessories for equipping central stations for supplying incandescent lighting. Barrel-chested and physically expansive, Westinghouse counterbalanced in appearance the spindle-legged foreigner, who walked as straight as an arrow, with his head erect, but with a preoccupied air as if new combinations were crystallizing in his brain.
Tesla said, though past 40 then, Westinghouse still had the enthusiasm of youth. Always smiling, affable and polite, he stood in marked contrast to the rough and ready men I met. Not one word which would have been objectionable. Not a gesture which might have offended. One could imagine him as moving in the atmosphere of a court, so perfect was his bearing in manner and speech. And yet no fiercer adversary than Westinghouse could have been found when he was aroused. An athlete in ordinary life, he was transformed into a giant when confronted with difficulties which seemed unsurmountable.
He enjoyed the struggle and never lost confidence.
When others would give up in despair, he triumphed.
Known for his foresight and courage, Westinghouse had already quadrupled the sales of his electric company, from $800,000 in 1887 to over $3 million in 1888. Even though he was in the midst of expensive legal and propaganda battles with Edison, extraordinary in his ability to generate enthusiasm in his workers and a decisive man of action, he immediately gained the respect of those he met, particularly Nikola Tesla.
Westinghouse offered Tesla $5,000 in cash for a 60-day option, $10,000 at the end of the option if they elected to purchase the patents, 3 notes of $20,000 at 6-month intervals, $2.5 per watt in royalties, and 200 shares of stock in the Westinghouse company.
Minimum payment on the royalties was calculated at $15,000 for the first year, $10,000 for the second year, and $15,000 for each succeeding year thereafter during the life of the patents. Westinghouse also agreed to pay for any legal expenses in litigation on priority issues, but a clause for lowering payments was added should any suits be lost.
Calculated out for 15 years, this figure, minus the stock, came to $75,000 in initial outlays and $180,000 in royalty payments, or approximately to $5,500.
Tesla owned 4/9 of his company, the balance shared by Peck and Brown, presumably 3/9 to the former partner and 2/9 to the latter. Concerning total amounts paid out by Westinghouse, Tesla also referred to European patents, especially in England and Germany. Thus, it is hard to determine exactly how much Tesla received for his 40 patents.
Westinghouse was not only getting a simple induction motor, but also a variety of synchronous and load-dependent motors as well as armatures, turbines, regulators, and dynamos. Tesla may have sold additional inventions later on in separate agreements. The value of his stock holding is also unclear.
A decade later, Tesla wrote to another financier, John Jacob Astor, that Mr. Westinghouse agreed to pay for my rotating field patents about $500,000, and despite hard times, he has lived up to every cent of his obligation.
Since Tesla was trying to raise money from Astor, he may have exaggerated the sum. 2 years earlier, Electrical Review noted that the Westinghouse annual report listed the purchase of the patents at $216,000. which is a figure that corresponds roughly to the Bilsby memorandum above, minus a few years' worth of royalty payments. If this was the case, then Tesla probably received for himself about half that figure, or $100,000, the entire amount paid in installments during the years 1888-97.
During the negotiations, Tesla agreed to move to Pittsburgh to help develop his motor. It is quite possible that he received no salary for his stay there, for he had a peculiar principle. Ever since I devoted myself to scientific laboratory research, never to accept fees or compensations for professional services.
Tesla had been paid for his patents and was receiving royalties or payments against royalties, so there was an income.
Further evidence that no additional daily or weekly compensation was received is implied in a signed agreement by George Westinghouse, dated July 27, 1889, substantiating that Tesla worked in Pittsburgh for 1 year and that during that time, he was paid with 151.50 shares of capital stock.
In return, Tesla promised to assign any patents to the Westinghouse company which were directly related to the development of his induction motor patents.
Other compensation was received from Westinghouse, however, for other contributions.
For instance, when Tesla discovered that Bessemer steel created a vastly superior transformer than ones made out of soft iron, Tesla was paid approximately $10,000 for the idea. Tesla gave up his garden apartment in New York and moved into one of several hotels in Pittsburgh, including the Metropolitan, the Duquesne, and the Anderson Hotel. Living would become a lifestyle which he never departed from. His talk, just 2 months old, had already catapulted him to fame.
About the middle of August 1888, in the Westinghouse testing room at Pittsburgh, Charles Scott, his assistant-to-be, remembered, "I had just come with the company and was assistant to E. Spooner, who was running the dynamos testing room at night.
He called me and said, 'There comes Tesla.' I had heard of Tesla," Scott continued, having read Tesla's paper on the polyphase induction motor, which my former college professor had pronounced as a complete solution of the motor problem. And now I was to see Tesla himself.
Fair-haired, with round, rimless glasses, Scott had only learned that there was such a thing as alternating current the summer before, in 1887.
I had graduated from college 2 years earlier, and I wondered why I had not heard of such things from my professors. His only introduction was an Electrical World article by William Stanley, which was a fascinating key to many mysteries.
Now, a year later, he was to meet Nikola Tesla, the man who so elegantly solved all the puzzles proposed by Stanley.
There he came, marching down the aisle with head and shoulders erect and with a twinkle in his eye. It was a great moment for me.
Scott, who later became an engineering professor at Yale University, was Tesla's wireman ... in preparing and making tests. It was a splendid opportunity for a beginner, this coming in contact with a man of such eminence, rich in ideas, kindly and friendly in disposition.
Tesla's fertile imagination often constructed air castles which seemed prodigious, but I doubt whether ever his extravagant expectations for the toy motor of those days measured up to actual realization. For the polyphase system which it inaugurated exceeded the wildest dreams of the early days. Scott was not only Tesla's assistant. As time went on and against the opinion of many colleagues, he became a champion of Tesla's cause, a bearer of the truth. That is, that Tesla was the inventor of the induction motor.
Another staunch supporter was Swiss immigrant Albert Schmid, co-author of 2 AC patents with Tesla.
Even though Westinghouse himself was also an ally, there was a bevy of other workers who tried seriously to strip Tesla of the crown. Major adversaries of the early period included Oliver Schallenberger, inventor of the AC meter, and his helpmate Louis B. Stilwell, inventor of the Stilwell booster, which operated somewhat like the Tesla coil.
At a later period, the key antagonist was Andrew W. Robertson, Westinghouse's chief executive officer.
Yet another opponent was William Stanley, the first American to have ever successfully instituted an AC system in the country.
Stanley had split off from the Westinghouse Corporation circa 1892-93 in order to sell his own polyphase motors, which were clear patent infringements on the Tesla system.
This position was supported by the courts a few years later, and Stanley was forced to purchase the Tesla motors from Westinghouse.